Have you ever been alone in the woods and felt absolutely certain that something was watching you? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck, that certainty that eyes are tracking your every movement from somewhere in the trees. Most of the time, it's just your imagination, your primitive brain responding to isolation and unfamiliar sounds. But in a place called Widow's Gap, deep in Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, that feeling isn't your imagination. There's something in those woods that watches, something that's been watching for a very, very long time. And once it starts watching you, it never stops. This is the story of Jenny Carson and what her camera saw in the shadows. After tonight, you'll understand why some people never come back from Widow's Gap, and why the ones who do are never quite the same. Jenny Carson had been a wildlife photographer for 12 years, and she'd never been afraid of the woods. She'd photographed grizzlies in Alaska, tracked wolves in Montana, and spent weeks alone in the backcountry capturing images of animals in their natural habitat. Fear wasn't part of her vocabulary. The wilderness was where she felt most alive, most at peace. It was civilization that made her anxious, the noise, the crowds, the constant connectivity. Give her a tent, a camera, and a forest, and she was home. So when her editor at Wild America magazine assigned her to photograph the fall foliage and wildlife in Virginia's George Washington National Forest, specifically in the Widow's Gap region, Jenny was thrilled. She'd heard the area was remote and pristine, exactly the kind of untouched wilderness she loved. She hadn't heard the stories, not yet. Jenny arrived in the small town of Crestfall on a crisp October afternoon. The drive from Richmond had taken 5 hours, the last hour on winding mountain roads that climbed higher and higher until the valley opened up below like something from a postcard. Crestfall consisted of a general store, a post office, and maybe 20 houses scattered along the main road. Population 147, according to the faded sign at the town limits. She stopped at the general store to stock up on supplies and get information about the best trails in the area. The store was dim and cramped, smelling of old wood and coffee. Behind the counter sat a man in his 70s with a weathered face and sharp eyes that studied her carefully as she approached. "Help you?" Jenny asked. "I'm looking for information about hiking trails around Widow's Gap," Jenny said, setting her supplies on the counter. "I'm a photographer, here to shoot the fall foliage and any wildlife I can find." The man's expression changed subtly. "Widow's Gap? You sure about that?" "That's where I was told to go. Why? Is there a problem?" He rang up her items slowly, seeming to choose his words carefully. "No problem exactly, just most photographers stick to the main trails. Widow's Gap is pretty remote. Not many people go up there anymore." "Perfect," Jenny said with a smile. "I prefer remote." The man handed her the receipt. "You going up there alone?" "That's the plan." He was quiet for a moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a topographical map, spreading it across the counter. His finger traced a route. "If you're determined to go, stay on the marked trails. Right here, the red blazes. Don't follow any unmarked paths, no matter how promising they look. And if you camp overnight, make sure you're out of the gap proper before dark. Camp on the ridge line, not in the valley." "Why?" Jenny asked, genuinely curious now. The old man folded the map and handed it to her. "Just local knowledge. The valley gets real foggy at night, easy to get disoriented." Jenny thanked him and left, but as she drove toward the trailhead, she couldn't shake the feeling that fog wasn't what he'd really been worried about. The trail into Widow's Gap was well maintained for the first 2 miles, a gentle climb through mixed hardwoods brilliant with autumn color. Jenny stopped frequently to photograph, the way sunlight filtered through golden leaves, a creek tumbling over moss-covered rocks, a hawk circling overhead. This was exactly what she'd come for. But as she went deeper, the trail became less distinct. The red blazes were still there, but farther apart, and the path itself narrowed to barely more than a deer trail in places. The forest changed too. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks massive and gnarled. The underbrush thickened, and gradually, Jenny became aware that the normal sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, chattering squirrels, were fading away. By the time she reached Widow's Gap proper, a narrow valley between two ridgelines, it was almost completely silent. Jenny checked her watch. 3:47 p.m. Still plenty of daylight left. She found a spot with a good vantage point and set up her camera on its tripod, using a telephoto lens to scan the valley below. The gap was beautiful in an eerie way. The valley floor was carpeted with ferns and wildflowers, and a thin mist hung in the air despite the afternoon sun. Perfect atmospheric shots. She spent the next hour photographing, moving to different positions, trying various angles and exposures. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the silence deepening around her, didn't notice that the mist in the valley was getting thicker, rising up the slopes toward where she stood. It wasn't until she reviewed the photos on her camera's display screen that she saw it. In the background of one shot, a wide-angle view of the valley, there was something among the trees. A shape, roughly human-sized, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall and too thin, with limbs that seemed too long. It was standing perfectly still about 50 yards away, partially obscured by a tree trunk. Jenny's breath caught. She looked up from the camera, scanning the tree line where the figure should be. Nothing there. She looked back at the display screen. The figure was still in the photo, clear as day. A chill ran down her spine. She told herself it was just a trick of light and shadow, a pattern in the bark and branches that happened to look vaguely humanoid. It happens all the time in nature photography. Pareidolia, the tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. But something about the shape bothered her. It was too deliberate, too symmetrical, and the more she looked at it, the more convinced she became that it was standing in a position that would give it a perfect view of her location. Jenny checked the timestamp on the photo, taken 7 minutes ago. She'd been standing in that exact spot for at least 10 minutes, completely focused on her camera, her back partially turned to the trees. If something had been there, it would have been watching her the whole time. She quickly packed up her equipment and started back up the trail toward the ridgeline. The old man's advice echoed in her mind. Camp on the ridgeline, not in the valley. She'd planned to camp near the valley floor for easier access to wildlife, but now the idea of spending the night down here made her skin crawl. As she climbed, Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She stopped several times, spinning around to look behind her, but the trail was empty. Just trees and shadows, and that thickening mist rising from the valley. She made camp on the ridgeline just as the sun touched the western peaks. The spot was exposed, but had a good view of the valley below. Jenny set up her tent quickly, working with the efficiency of long practice, then started a fire. The temperature was dropping fast, and the warmth was welcome. As darkness fell, she sat by the fire reviewing the day's photos on her laptop. Most were excellent, exactly the kind of atmospheric wilderness shots her editor wanted. But she kept coming back to that one image, the one with the figure in the background. She zoomed in on it, enhancing the contrast and brightness. Her blood ran cold. With the image enhanced, she could see more details. The figure wasn't just tall and thin, it was wrong. The arms hung down to where the knees should be. The head was too small for the body, or maybe it didn't have a head at all, just a narrow column where the neck should be. And the position of the body suggested it was leaning out from behind the tree, as if deliberately trying to stay hidden while still maintaining line of sight on her. As if it was studying her. Jenny quickly looked away from the screen, her heart pounding. She scanned the darkness beyond her firelight, seeing nothing but trees and stars. The forest was absolutely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just that oppressive, unnatural quiet. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. It was a trick of light. It had to be. She was letting the isolation and the creepy atmosphere get to her. She'd get a good night's sleep, and in the morning she'd see how ridiculous she was being. But she kept her hunting knife close as she climbed into her tent, and she didn't sleep well. She woke before dawn to the sound of something moving outside her tent. Jenny lay perfectly still, listening. There, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling her campsite. But they didn't sound quite right. The rhythm was off, and they seemed too heavy, each step making a dull thud against the ground. She grabbed her knife and her flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, providing almost no light. Jenny clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam around the campsite. Nothing. But there, in the dirt near her tent, were marks. Not quite footprints, more like something had been dragged across the ground in a semicircle around where she'd slept. And at the edge of the circle, pressed into the soft earth, was something that made her stomach turn. A handprint, but with 6 fingers, each one impossibly long and thin.
Jenny packed up camp in record time, her hands shaking as she stuffed her sleeping bag and tent into their bags. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, but she couldn't wait for full daylight. She had to get out of Widow's Gap. Now. She started down the trail at a near run, her heavy pack bouncing against her back. The forest was still silent, still wrapped in that unnatural quiet. And with every step, Jenny had the overwhelming sensation that she was being watched from the trees. She'd made it maybe half a mile when she realized she'd made a mistake. The trail had forked, and in her panic, she'd taken the wrong path. This wasn't the red-blazed trail that led back to the parking area. This was an unmarked trail, narrower and less maintained, leading deeper into the forest. Jenny stopped, breathing hard, trying to orient herself. She'd brought the map the old man gave her, but in her rush to leave camp, she'd shoved it in her pack. She started to unsling the pack to find it when she heard something that made her freeze. Whistling. It was coming from somewhere ahead on the trail, a tuneless, atonal sound that rose and fell in no particular pattern, but it was definitely meant to mimic whistling, as if something that didn't quite understand music was trying to copy what it had heard humans do. The sound stopped. Then, after a moment of silence, it came from a different direction, behind her now. Then from the left. Then from the right. Jenny spun in a slow circle, her flashlight beam cutting through the dim forest. She couldn't see anything, but the whistling continued, coming from all around her now, closing in. She ran. The trail twisted and turned, leading her deeper into unfamiliar territory. Branches whipped at her face and arms. Her pack caught on undergrowth, slowing her down. And all around her, that whistling followed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never stopping. Jenny burst into a clearing and stopped so suddenly she nearly fell. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and it was filled with objects, carefully arranged objects. Backpacks, hiking boots, cameras, canteens, all old, weathered by years of exposure, but laid out in precise rows like a museum display. And at the far end of the clearing, partially hidden by morning mist, were larger objects. Bones. Human bones, arranged in the same careful, deliberate way. Dozens of skeletons, all positioned as if they'd been studied, cataloged, preserved. Jenny's legs nearly gave out. This wasn't just one missing hiker, this was decades worth of disappearances, all brought to this place, all arranged like specimens in a collection. The whistling stopped. In the sudden silence, Jenny heard something else. Breathing. Slow, deep breaths coming from multiple locations around the clearing. She raised her flashlight with trembling hands and swept it across the tree line. Eyes reflected back at her. Dozens of pairs of eyes, too high off the ground, too far apart, watching her from the darkness between the trees. And then,
They moved. The things emerged from the forest slowly, deliberately, their movements jerky and wrong. They were roughly humanoid but distorted, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. 7 or 8 feet tall, with arms that hung nearly to the ground and legs that bent at too many joints. Their heads were small and featureless, except for those eyes, large, dark, and completely focused on her. They didn't approach aggressively. They simply surrounded the clearing, standing at its edges, watching her the same way a scientist might watch a rat in a maze. One of them, the closest one, raised an impossibly long arm and pointed at Jenny's camera still hanging from her neck. It made a sound, a clicking vocalization that might have been trying to form words but came out garbled and wrong. Ra. Show us. Jenny's mind reeled. It was trying to communicate. These things, whatever they weren't just animals. They had intelligence. They'd been watching humans, studying them, collecting their belongings, trying to understand them. And now they wanted her to show them the camera. "No," Jenny whispered, backing away. "No, stay away from me." The creatures tilted their small heads in unison, a gesture that was disturbingly curious. One made that clicking sound again. "Why? Run. We watch. We learn." "You killed those people," Jenny said, her voice shaking. She gestured at the bones. "All those people." The closest creature looked at the arranged skeletons, then back at Jenny. "Not kill, keep, preserve. They teach us." Understanding dawned on Jenny with sick horror. These things weren't hunting humans. They were studying them. Every person who disappeared in Widow's Gap had been observed, tracked, and eventually collected, their belongings and remains carefully preserved like specimens in some grotesque natural history museum. The creatures were researchers, and humans were their subject of study. "We want to learn," the creature continued, taking a step closer. Its movements were slow, non-threatening, like it was trying not to spook her. "You make pictures. Show us. Teach us." Jenny's hand moved to the hunting knife at her belt. "Don't come any closer." The creatures stopped. They looked at each other, that same synchronized head tilt. Then the one that had been speaking raised both its impossibly long arms in what might have been a placating gesture. "Not hurt, just watch. Always watch. Learn from you." "How long?" Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been watching people?" The creature's head tilted the other way. "Long. Many seasons. Many, many. We watch, you come. You go. You change. We learn." "The people you've kept here," Jenny said, gesturing at the bones. "They didn't want to teach you. They wanted to leave." "They scared. Run. Get lost. We find them. Keep them safe." The creature gestured at the arranged belongings with what seemed like pride. "We care for their things. Remember them." In the creature's alien logic, Jenny realized, it thought it was being respectful, preserving, honoring these people by keeping their remains and possessions carefully arranged. It didn't understand that it had terrified them, driven them to panic, that its presence itself had caused their deaths. These things had been watching humans for possibly centuries, studying them from the shadows, trying to learn, trying to understand. And in their attempts to get closer, to preserve what they'd observed, they'd become the very monsters that haunted these woods. "I need to leave," Jenny said carefully. "I need to go back to my people. They'll be worried about me." The creatures looked at each other again, that eerie, synchronized movement. Then the speaker turned back to her. "You come back? Teach us more?" "Maybe," Jenny lied, edging toward what looked like another trail leading out of the clearing. "But I need to leave now.
Will you let me go?" There was a long pause. The creatures seemed to be conferring silently, their dark eyes watching her, weighing her words. Finally, the speaker nodded, a too sharp movement, like it had seen humans nod but couldn't quite replicate the motion correctly. "Go," it said, "but we watch. Always watch. We see you. Always." Jenny didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran for the trail, her heart hammering, expecting at any moment to feel those long fingers closing around her. But the creatures didn't follow. They just stood at the clearing's edge, perfectly still, watching her go. She ran for what felt like hours, until the unmarked trail finally connected with the red-blazed path she recognized. The sun was higher now, and with the daylight, the forest began to sound normal again. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze. But Jenny didn't slow down until she saw her car in the parking lot. She threw her gear in the trunk and drove away from Widow's Gap as fast as the mountain roads would allow, not stopping until she reached Crestfall. She went straight to the general store. The old man behind the counter took one look at her face and went pale. "You saw them," he said. It wasn't a question. Jenny nodded, too shaken to speak. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Most people who see them don't make it out. The Watchers usually keep what they find." "The Watchers?" Jenny repeated. "That's what my grandfather called them. Said they've been in these mountains longer than anyone knows, watching, studying, collecting. He saw them once when he was young. Got turned around on a hunting trip and stumbled into their clearing. He said they let him go because he spoke to them calmly, didn't run. But they watched him for the rest of his life. He'd see them sometimes, standing at the edge of the woods near his house, just standing there, watching." Jenny's blood ran cold. "For the rest of his life?" The old man nodded slowly. "They don't forget, the Watchers. Once they've observed you, once they've added you to their study, they keep watching. He died 5 years ago, and the night he passed, my wife swore she saw something tall and thin standing at the edge of our property, like it had come to witness the end of what it had been studying." Jenny felt sick. "So I'm not free. They'll keep watching me." "Maybe, or maybe you'll be luckier than my grandfather." But his expression said he didn't believe that. Jenny left Crestfall that afternoon and drove straight through to Richmond, barely stopping except for gas. She submitted her photos to the magazine, carefully editing out any images that showed the figure in the background, and took a 2-week vacation to recover. But recovery didn't come, because the old man had been right. The Watchers hadn't forgotten her. It started small, a sense of being observed when she was alone in her apartment, the feeling of eyes on her when she walked through the park near her building. Once, she woke in the middle of the night and saw something tall and thin standing on the fire escape outside her window, perfectly still, just watching. By the time she turned on the lights, it was gone. She started reviewing all her photos obsessively, zooming in on backgrounds, looking for evidence. And she found it. In pictures she'd taken weeks before going to Widow's Gap, photos from other assignments, other locations. There, in the background, partially hidden by trees or shadows or distance, the Watchers. They'd been following her for longer than she'd realized. Maybe they'd been following her for years. Jenny stopped taking wilderness assignments. She started working from home, shooting urban landscapes and studio portraits. She kept her curtains closed. She avoided being alone in open spaces. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed. Because that's what the Watchers do. They watch, they study, they collect data on their subjects over entire lifetimes. And once you've been marked as interesting enough to observe, they never, ever stop. 3 months after Widow's Gap, Jenny sold her camera equipment. She couldn't stand looking through a viewfinder anymore. Couldn't stand the idea that something might be watching her while she was focused on watching something else. But even without the camera, she knows they're there.
She sees them sometimes in her peripheral vision, tall, thin shapes that disappear when she looks directly at them. She feels them most strongly at night, when the city is quiet and she's alone in her apartment. The Watchers are patient. They've been studying humans for centuries, maybe longer. They can afford to wait, to observe, to learn. They're not predators. They're scientists in their own alien way. But that doesn't make them any less terrifying. Because somewhere in the mountains of Virginia, in a clearing deep in Widow's Gap, there's a space waiting. A spot where Jenny's belongings will be carefully arranged, where her bones will be respectfully preserved, where she'll become another specimen in their eternal collection. The Watchers are waiting for her to return, and Jenny knows, with a certainty that keeps her awake every night, that eventually she will. Because they're always watching. They see everything, and what they observe, they eventually collect. It's not a matter of if, only when.
Jenny Carson moved to Seattle 6 months ago, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as she could get without leaving the country. She works in an office now, processing data, never going into the field. She keeps her blinds closed and avoids wooded areas. But sometimes, on foggy mornings when she's walking to work, she sees them at the edges of parks and green spaces. Tall, thin silhouettes that stand perfectly still among the trees. The Watchers followed her across the country. They're still studying her, still learning, still waiting. And she knows that one day, probably soon, they'll decide they've learned enough. Then they'll come to collect. Because that's what the Watchers do. They observe until they understand. Then they preserve what they've studied. Forever. If this story has you checking the shadows outside your window, hit that subscribe button for more terrifying tales from Appalachia. And remember, if you're ever hiking alone and feel like something is watching you, trust that instinct. Because in some places, you're not paranoid, you're observed, and something is taking notes.